but it seemed very, very boastful to be like involved in a big drama. Because
she had the sensation that she was boasting.
But we thought because she was American.
E comunque, say anything about seeing the body of Meredith?
Yes.
Sì.
She said she was on the phone. Later, she was on the phone.
Stava parlando al telefono con qualcuno.
And I heard her say.
E l'ho sentita dire.
I found her.
Io l'ho trovata.
And then the person spoke back to her. She was quiet.
E poi la persona con cui interloquiva evidentemente le ha detto qualcosa.
Said, I saw her.
E dopodiché Amanda ha detto io l'ho vista.
Ha visto il cadavere.
I saw her. She just said I saw her. She didn't say I saw her corpse. I saw her. Yeah. You remember this?
Yeah, like I saw her like dead body, but I saw her.
I got nightmares in my head. I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. That's a audio of the deposition made by Samantha Rodenhurst, who is 20 years old. She was one of Meredith Kurtz's friends. And that's a short excerpt from her deposition. I'll put a full link to that in the description. All right, so if there was a blood-curdling scream and someone thought they heard multiple attackers running off in opposite directions, is there any evidence, any witnesses who saw two perpetrators skulking around outside? Well, it turns out there were not one or two, but three amigos who testified in court saying they saw Amanda Knox outside the cottage, not just Amanda Knox, but also Raffaele Sollecito in one case, or I think two cases, when she wasn't supposed to be, when they weren't supposed to be there. Let's go through them one by one. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, a new notebook has just come out, so if you're interested in it, I'll put a link to that notebook in the description. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So, the first of the three amigos, Antonio Curatolo, a homeless man who lived in Piazza Grimana. When I visited Perugia, the first place I recognized was a place I'd written about extensively, and while we were driving into Perugia, I recognized it. And it's so important because mystery still surrounds what actually happened there on Piazza Grimana on the night of the murder. And don't you think it's got an apt name? Piazza Grimana. Grimana. Now, it makes absolute sense that if there was going to be any witness who had to have seen something, it was going to be Curatolo, and that's for two reasons. Number one, Curatolo essentially lived in Piazza Grimana. That's no exaggeration. He was a homeless dude, 51 years old at the time, and he'd been living in the piazza for something like 8 or 9 years. So since he was about 43 years old, he'd been living in that piazza. On March 28, 2009, 18 long months since Meredith's murder, ABC News described Curatolo appearing in court. Let's have a look at that article. Quote, wheeled to the witness stand in an office chair, Curatolo, who has a long grey beard and wore a coat, a hat and scarf in court, said that he had been sleeping on a park bench in Perugia's Piazza Grimana for 8 or 9 years. He was testifying because it is a question of conscience, he said, adding that he did not wish to harm anyone. On the night before Kurtz's body was discovered, he said, he was sitting on a bench in Piazza Grimana reading a news magazine and smoking cigarettes. The plaza was busy with young people, he said, but he noticed one couple whom he identified in court as Knox and Sollecito talking. And that brings us to the second reason Curatolo's testimony mattered. Number 2, Piazza Grimana is a small square right next to the cottage. If you're familiar with Perugia, you'll know that from the cottage, the most logical place to go is the piazza. And it's also really the only place you can go because it's right next door to the cottage and it connects into the rest of Perugia. Now, you could walk along the road, and that basically means you're walking with traffic that is going to narrowly miss you. That's both ways. And it's not a natural way to walk. It might be a natural way to drive. As I mentioned earlier, when I visited Perugia, the first place I recognized was a place I'd written about extensively, and that is the aptly named Piazza Grimana. It was also the first place I walked to from the driveway of the cottage. It's less than a 30-second walk. And the first thing I did there was stand beside the railing and look back towards the cottage to see what sort of line of sight there is. Interestingly, this is precisely the ambit of Curatolo's testimony. He testified in 2009 that he saw Raffaele Sollecito, Knox's boyfriend at the time, and obviously someone who knew the look and feel of Perugia a lot better than Knox did, standing, well, let's go to the news article that recounts what Curatolo testified that he saw. From ABC News, the plaza was busy with young people, he said, but he noticed one couple whom he identified in court as Knox and Sollecito talking animatedly. So I guess it's another way of saying talking in an excited way. At one point, Sollecito went to a railing at the edge of the square and looked down in the direction of the house where Kircher was killed, Curatolo said. Now, I've gone to that exact same railing. I've also leaned down and done the exact same thing. The couple was in the square from about 9:30 p.m. until just before midnight, according to Curatolo. Based on an autopsy, investigators believe that Kircher died in the same time period. Two women testified Friday that they heard a scream coming from the direction of the house where Kircher was murdered on November 1st between 11 p.m. and 11:30 p.m. On paper, if there was a scream, it makes sense that multiple attackers would get the hell out of there. And for prosecutors, well, it made sense that if someone elected to cover up and stage the crime scene, this is after they'd run out of there, well, then they'd have to check whether the coast was clear. And where better to do that than from right here, from Piazza Grimana. That was one of the first things I did, as I say, after parking the car. I went to that railing and I went to check the line of sight for myself from the piazza to the cottage. What do you think I found? Now let's go to the Independent. But at another point, Curatolo also said he clearly remembers seeing police at the house the morning after he saw Knox and Sollecito in the square. Curatolo's testimony, certainly in 2009, seemed like a smoking gun, didn't it? Perhaps the best evidence not only that Knox's version was BS, but Sollecito's too. In any event, that's Amigo number 1, and there's an unfortunate postscript to the story, but let's move on to Amigo number 2, B. Hekuran Kokani, Albanian agricultural worker. 34-year-old Kokani had quite a story to tell. In his account, he apparently came face to face with a young woman right outside the cottage, and this woman brandished a knife at him. According to The Guardian, quote, Kokani has claimed that Knox threatened him with a 30-centimeter, that's 12-inch kitchen knife, although he has changed other details of his encounter between the first statement he gave to investigators in January and a second in May. In the second statement, he said he hit Sollecito and threw some olives he had in his car at KNOX. He cannot recall whether he saw the three on October 31st or November 1st, the night of the murder. There's also this report from Fox News, dated March 28, 2009, and this is dealing with Kokani's testimony. Occasionally speaking in Albanian through a translator and often mumbling, Kokani said he was driving and then stopped in front of the building where he bumped into a big black trash bag. I think by building he's talking about the villa or the cottage. This bag turned out to be Knox and Solicitor, Kokani said, identifying the suspects in court. He then said he punched Solicitor while Knox threatened him with a knife. This girl pulled out a 16-inch knife from a green bag and brandished it, saying, "Come here and I'll show you," Kokani said, gesturing with his hands. He said Knox was holding the knife above her head with both hands, but was not pointing it at him. Kokani said Solicitor tried to reassure him, saying, "She's a girl, she's not doing anything." If you're getting a niggly sense that Kokomani's story is either too good to be true or downright cockamamie, did you see what I did there? Kokomani, cockamamie. Well, you wouldn't be the only one to feel a little dubious. And actually, unfortunately, there's a good reason to be doubtful about Kokomani's testimony. But let's go on to Amigo number 3, and that is C, Marco Quintavale, shopkeeper. Of the 3 amigos, I think Quintavale, that's my opinion, is the most reliable. And certainly if the prosecution were entertaining a staging and cover-up theory, then Quintavale's testimony theoretically holds hands with Curatolo's. It's this idea that if you were going to cover up a bloody crime scene, besides scouting out the scene late at night, you were also going to need some cleaning products, weren't you? Now, let's go to NBC News for their report on this testimony, and it's titled, "Witness Contradicts Amanda Knox's Account." Quote, "Witness Marco Quintavale said Saturday that a young woman entered his grocery store near Solicitor's house in Perugia at 7:45 a.m. on November 2nd, 2007. He said the woman was waiting for him to open the store and that he and she exchanged glances when she entered. It really struck me. She had a very pale face and these light eyes," said Quintavale. I can still see the image in my head." Asked by the presiding judge if that woman was present in the courtroom, Quintavale said he was sure it was Amanda Knox. "Now I'm sure," he said, looking at her. Knox did not appear to react. Just like the tramp Curatolo, if Quintavale is correct in who he saw and when, and there couldn't have been too many blue-eyed Americans traipsing about that early on a holiday in a student town, after a night of partying, well, then there seemed to be 2 witnesses contradicting Knox's account that she was with Solicitor all night at his apartment and that she slept late on the morning of the murder until 10 a.m. In the same way that it's remarkable that Curatolo seemed to observe Solicitor looking towards the villa, Quintavale noted that the young woman with remarkable blue eyes entered his store, this is important, just as it opened that day. That's quite unusual. Back to ABC News, Quintavale told prosecutor Giuliano Mignini that a young woman with remarkable blue eyes and a face so pale that he was struck by it entered his store just as he opened it that day. She was wearing jeans, a grey jacket and a hat, he said. She went to the upper level of the store, which is just down the road from Solicitor's house, without returning his greeting. And I guess that's also interesting, is that he greeted her and she didn't actually greet him back. And then she left shortly thereafter, heading down the street in the direction of the house, the cottage, where Kircher was killed. Quintavale said he did not see if she had purchased anything because he was not at the cash register. That is a major bummer. When newspapers published photographs of Amanda Knox after she was arrested 4 days later, Quintavale said, "Wow, I recognize her. I recognize her as the young woman who entered my shop." Now, unfortunately, Quintavale didn't pay attention to what the young woman purchased. Imagine if he had. Imagine if it was bleach. It would be one possible indicator for the mysterious, it could be an explanation for the mysterious lack of DNA evidence, because bleach destroys DNA, or why the outside of Meredith's room was as clean as it was, including the bloody shoe prints wiped away in the passage between Meredith's door and the front door. It could also possibly explain the smell of bleach that some officers noted the moment they entered Solicitor's apartment. This evidence, and let's say evidence in inverted commas, also holds hands in inverted commas, perhaps in a sense, with a playlist from Celeste's computer that appeared to be awake, that showed someone awake very early that morning, even before the shop had opened. And this playlist went on to 6:18 a.m. and Quintal was saying that he saw this particular person about an hour later. Does that make sense? Now, if you think it doesn't make sense, even Amanda Knox admitted that she carried a mop from the cottage to Celeste's apartment on that morning of all mornings, that is the 2nd of November 2007, hours before Meredith's body was discovered. And of course they found the washing machine fully loaded and by some accounts on and still warm, filled with Meredith's clothing and a few items of Knox's as well. Now you might say, yawn, snore, all of these fragments don't really take you anywhere, and wasn't Knox acquitted at the end of the day? If you said that, you'd be right. But I think why that happened, in spite of this testimony, and how that happened, is a very interesting story. Anyone care to hear it? I'm not going to take it further than that, but I just want to draw your attention to these stills, these images of an actress pretending to be Amanda Knox for a movie or series. And look at what she's doing. She's carrying a mop. And doesn't it look a little bit strange? Even in hindsight, even where we are today, recreating Knox's story, and this is Knox recreating her own story, doesn't it seem very, very bizarre to be carrying a mop from the villa, from the cottage, to Celeste's home on the morning of the murder? What do you think? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.